The smoke was still rising from the remains of Abigail Zimmerman's life, as she stood frozen on the crest of the hill, watching the last embers of her family's homestead glow against the darkening Wyoming sky. It was 1876, and in a single afternoon, the drought-parched timber of her father's carefully built ranch house had transformed from sanctuary to inferno, leaving nothing but ash and charred dreams in its wake. The wind picked up, cool against her soot-streaked face. Abigail barely registered the chill despite her thin calico dress, the numbness inside her far more penetrating than any mountain breeze. Somewhere in that smoldering ruin lay the bodies of her parents, Thomas and Martha Zimmerman, who'd perished trying to save what precious little they had from the racing flames. At 22, Abigail was now entirely alone in the world. No family, no home, no hope. Just the clothes on her back and a heart so heavy she wondered how her legs still managed to support her. "Miss, you've been standing there near 3 hours." The deep voice startled her, though she couldn't summon the energy to turn. Hoofbeats approached slowly, then stopped beside her. From the corner of her eye she saw dusty boots swing down from a saddle. "Name's Wyatt Thompson," the man said quietly. "Ranch foreman over at the Silver Creek spread." Abigail said nothing, her eyes fixed on the ruins below. What was there to say? That she'd just lost everything. That she had nowhere to go. The stranger Wyatt moved to stand beside her. He was tall, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the purpling twilight. Without another word, he unfolded a woolen blanket from his saddlebag and draped it carefully around her shoulders. "Stay," he said simply, his voice gentle but firm. "You'll catch your death out here when night falls proper." Something in his tone, not pity, but understanding, finally made her turn. She found herself looking up into a face weathered by sun and wind, stubbled with several days' growth of beard. Eyes the color of faded denim regarded her steadily beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. He wasn't a young man, but neither was he old, perhaps 30 or so, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into many sunsets. "There's nothing to stay for," Abigail finally managed, her voice raw from smoke and unshed tears. Wyatt Thompson glanced at the smoldering ruins, then back at her. "Not here, maybe, but my boss has a cabin empty since our last hand moved on. It's yours if you want it, at least until you figure things out." "Why would you help me?" Suspicion flared briefly through her exhaustion. "You don't know me." His expression remained steady, unreadable. "Known plenty of hard times myself. Besides, folks in Wyatt take care of their own." Abigail pulled the blanket tighter, suddenly aware of how cold she'd become. Wyatt. The town had always seemed so distant from their isolated homestead, a place her father visited for supplies but never lingered, a place she barely knew. "I can't pay," she said, wasn't asking for payment. He stepped back, giving her space. "Decision's yours. Cabin's there if you want it, or I can take you to town to the boarding house." The thought of being surrounded by strangers, by curious eyes and whispered sympathy, was unbearable. At least a cabin offered solitude to grieve. "The cabin," she whispered. Wyatt nodded once as if he'd expected no other answer. "Can you ride?" "Yes." He extended a hand, calloused and strong. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail took it, allowing herself to be led to his horse. The animal, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patiently as Wyatt helped her up, then mounted behind her. As they rode away, Abigail kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back at the ruins of her past. The blanket smelled of leather, horses, and tobacco, strange yet oddly comforting as they headed toward an uncertain future in the gathering Wyoming dusk. The Silver Creek Ranch sprawled across the valley like a kingdom unto itself, its borders marked by rolling grasslands that seemed to stretch endlessly, beneath the vast night sky. By the time they arrived, full darkness had descended, with only a silver of moon illuminating their path to a small cabin set apart from the main house and bunkhouse. "It's not much," Wyatt said as he helped her dismount, her legs stiff from the ride. "But it's tight against the weather and has a good stove." The cabin was indeed small, a single room with a stone fireplace at one end, a narrow bed in the corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding basic provisions. Yet compared to the nothingness Abigail now possessed, it seemed an abundance of riches. Wyatt moved efficiently around the space, lighting a lantern and stoking a fire in the hearth. The sudden warmth made Abigail realize how deeply cold she'd become, her body trembling beneath the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "You need to rest," he said, straightening from the hearth. "There's some clothes in that trunk belong to Mrs. Holloway, our cook. She's a good bit wider than you, but they'll do until we can get your own things." Abigail swallowed hard. "I don't have any own things anymore." Something flickered across Wyatt's face, not pity, but a deeper understanding. "I'll fetch some water and food, then I'll leave you be." When he returned with a tray of simple fare bread, dried beef, a wedge of cheese, and a pitcher of water, Abigail had changed into a flannel nightgown that hung loosely on her frame. She'd washed her face in the basin, revealing skin pale as milk beneath the soot, with a scatter of freckles across her nose and cheeks. Her auburn hair, freed from its pins, fell in waves past her shoulders. Wyatt set the tray down and headed for the door without meeting her eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she called softly, stopping him at the threshold. "Thank you." He nodded once, still not looking directly at her. "Mrs. Holloway will check on you tomorrow. Try to sleep, Miss Zimmerman." Then he was gone, leaving Abigail alone with her grief and exhaustion. She forced herself to eat a few bites, knowing she needed strength, then curled up on the narrow bed, pulling his blanket tight around her. Sleep claimed her eventually, but brought no peace. In her dreams, she ran through endless corridors of flame, hearing her parents' voices calling out to her, always just beyond reach. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window to illuminate a world Abigail barely recognized as her own. For one disoriented moment, she expected to be in her childhood bedroom, to hear her mother calling her down to breakfast. Reality crashed back with cruel swiftness. A gentle knock at the door roused her fully. A round woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes entered, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Miss Zimmerman, I'm Hannah Holloway. Brought you some breakfast and a few things you might need." Her voice was warm with sympathy, but mercifully free of the cloying pity Abigail dreaded. Over a breakfast of fresh biscuits and preserves, Mrs. Holloway talked of practical matters, where to find things, the routine of the ranch, how to work the temperamental stove. She mentioned, almost casually, that they would be holding a service for Thomas and Martha Zimmerman the following day. "The men recovered their remains this morning," she explained gently. "Mr. Thornton, he owns the ranch, insisted they be properly buried in the town cemetery, with the pastor saying words." Abigail set down her cup, her hand suddenly unsteady. "I have nothing to pay for a funeral. That's been seen to," Mrs. Holloway assured her. "Mr. Thornton is a good Christian man, and your father did business with him on occasion." After Mrs. Holloway left, promising to return later with proper clothing, Abigail ventured outside. The cabin sat on a small rise, offering a view of the main ranch house, an impressive 2-story structure of timber and stone, and the various outbuildings that comprised the working heart of the operation. In the distance, she could see men on horseback moving cattle across the grassland, tiny figures against the vastness of the Wyoming landscape. The air smelled of pine, earth, and the ever-present dust of the high plains. Miss Zimmerman. She turned to find Wyatt approaching on foot, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. He'd shaved, she noticed, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden by stubble. Mr. Thompson. She pulled her borrowed shawl tighter, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. Wanted to make sure you found everything you needed. His eyes, she noticed, were the precise color of the Wyoming sky in summer, a clear, weathered blue. Mrs. Holloway has been very kind. He nodded, his gaze moving to the distant horizon. About your parents. We'll be holding a service tomorrow. I hope that meets with your approval. Yes, thank you. The words felt hollow, inadequate. And there's the matter of your property, he continued. By rights, your father's land passes to you now. Abigail felt a flicker of something, not hope exactly, but perhaps purpose. The land itself wasn't damaged. No, madam, just the structures. It's good land, 160 acres of it. Your father worked hard for that homestead. Yes, he did. For the first time since the fire, tears threatened to spill from Abigail's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. Wyatt seemed to notice her struggle. He cleared his throat. Anyway, there's no rush to decide anything. You're welcome here as long as needed. That evening, Abigail stood at the cabin window, watching darkness settle over the ranch. The main house glowed with lamplight, and she could hear the distant sounds of men talking and laughing in the bunkhouse. The normalcy of it all seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of her shattered life. She was still standing there when Wyatt appeared again, this time carrying a small wooden box. Found these in town, he said, setting the box on the table. Thought you might want them. Inside were a hairbrush, a small mirror, a cake of lavender soap, and a bottle of rose water. Simple items, but in that moment, they represented a dignity Abigail had feared lost forever. The funeral's at 10 tomorrow, he said, backing toward the door. I'll come for you at 9:30 if that suits. Abigail nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in her throat. After he left, she opened the bottle of rose water, its familiar scent unleashing memories of her mother dabbing it behind her ears on Sundays. This time, she couldn't stop the tears. They came in a flood, racking her body with silent sobs until exhaustion claimed her once more. The funeral was a small affair, attended by a handful of townspeople who had known Thomas Zimmerman through his occasional visits to Wyatt. Pastor Miller spoke of resurrection and God's mercy, words that washed over Abigail without penetrating the armor of her grief. She stood rigid beside the freshly dug graves, dressed in a black bombazine dress borrowed from one of the ranch hand's wives. The garment hung loose on her slender frame, but its color suited her mood. Wyatt stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, head bowed. When it was over, and the small crowd had dispersed after offering condolences, Abigail remained, staring at the twin mounds of earth that now held her entire family. They would want you to go on living, Wyatt said quietly, coming to stand beside her. I don't know how, she admitted, speaking the raw truth that had haunted her since the fire. One day at a time, he replied. That's all any of us can do. As they rode back to the ranch, Abigail's thoughts turned to the future she'd never planned for. I should see the property, she said suddenly. My father's land. Wyatt glanced over his shoulder at her. If you're sure you're ready, I'm not, she said truthfully, but I need to face it. The next morning, Wyatt brought 2 horses to her cabin. This is Daisy, he said, indicating a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze on her forehead. She's got a smooth gait, good for someone who hasn't ridden much. I can ride, Abigail informed him, a touch of her former spirit showing through. My father taught me on an ornery Mustang when I was 7. A ghost of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. "Daisy it is, then. Just the same." The ride to her father's property took nearly 2 hours, across rolling grassland dotted with sage and wildflowers. As they crested the final hill, Abigail steeled herself for the sight of devastation. The charred skeleton of the house stood stark against the blue sky, a monument to all she had lost. Yet surrounding it, the land continued its timeless existence, grass waving in the breeze, a hawk circling overhead, the distant silver ribbon of a creek cutting through the property. "It's still beautiful," she whispered, surprised by the thought. Wyatt nodded. "Best grazing land in the county." "Your father knew what he was about when he claimed it." They dismounted, tethering the horses to a surviving fence post. Abigail approached the ruins cautiously, as if they might still harbor hidden flames. The smell of ash and charred wood hung heavy in the air. "Looks like the fire started here," Wyatt said, pointing to what had been the kitchen. "Probably the stove." Abigail nodded. Her mother had always complained about that stove's temperamental nature. A spark, a moment's inattention while her father napped and her mother worked in the garden, that's all it would have taken. Among the ruins, she found surprisingly intact items. A cast iron skillet, blackened but solid, a metal box containing family documents, partially protected by a stone hearth, a porcelain doll's head, eerily unmarred amidst the destruction. "We can salvage the foundation," Wyatt observed, walking the perimeter of what had been the house. "Stone's still good, if you wanted to rebuild." Abigail clutched the doll's head, its blank eyes staring up at her. Rebuild. The concept seemed impossible, a mountain too high to even contemplate climbing. "Or sell," he added carefully. "Land this good won't sit on the market long." The thought of strangers living here, walking the ground her parents had loved, struck Abigail as unbearable. Yet what alternative did she have? A woman alone couldn't work 160 acres, couldn't rebuild a house, couldn't survive the harsh Wyoming winters without help. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the words difficult to speak aloud. Wyatt studied her for a long moment. "You don't have to decide today or tomorrow. Take time to think." On the ride back to Silver Creek, they stopped by the creek that gave the ranch its name. While the horses drank, Wyatt produced a simple lunch from his saddlebag: bread, cheese, dried apples. "Tell me about them," he said as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood. "Your parents." The request surprised Abigail, but she found herself speaking, haltingly at first, then with growing ease. She told him of her father, a schoolteacher from Boston who'd caught prairie fever and headed west with dreams of open spaces. Of her mother, a minister's daughter who'd scandalized her family by eloping with the adventure-seeking educator. "They loved it here," she said. "Even when times were hard, and they often were, they never regretted coming. My mother used to say the sky alone was worth the journey." Wyatt listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing her words to flow uninterrupted. It was the most she'd spoken since the fire, and somehow, giving voice to memories eased something tight in her chest. "They sound like fine people," Wyatt said when she finally fell silent. "The kind who raise a daughter strong enough to survive what you've been through." Abigail looked away, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words affected her. "I don't feel very strong." "Yet here you are," he replied simply, "still standing." The days began to take on a rhythm. Each morning, Abigail rose with the sun, washed and dressed in the clothes Mrs. Holloway had altered to fit her slender frame. She took her meals at the cookhouse, initially enduring the curious stares of the ranch hands, who gradually accepted her presence as unremarkable. In the afternoons, she helped Mrs. Holloway with household tasks: mending, preserving, baking. The older woman asked no probing questions, but offered quiet companionship and practical wisdom that anchored Abigail in the turbulent sea of her grief. Wyatt appeared most evenings, ostensibly to check if she needed anything, though these visits often extended into conversations that stretched well past sunset. He spoke of his own life, born in Missouri, orphaned young, raised by an uncle who taught him ranching before drinking himself to death. He drifted west, working cattle drives across Texas and up to Wyoming, eventually finding a permanent position at Silver Creek. "Mr. Thornton's a fair boss," Wyatt explained one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch. "Pays well and treats his men like humans, not just hired hands. Rare quality in a ranch owner. I'd like to thank him," Abigail said, "for allowing me to stay for the funeral arrangements. He's not much for thanks, but I'll let him know you asked after him." Wyatt leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs before him. "He's gone to Cheyenne for a cattlemen's meeting. Won't be back for another week or so." The mention of Cheyenne sparked a memory. "My father used to go there sometimes to the bank. I wonder if he had accounts there." Wyatt nodded thoughtfully. "Worth looking into. I could ride with you there once you're feeling up to it." The offer touched something in Abigail, not just the practical assistance, but the assumption that she would eventually be up to such a journey, that she had a future worth planning for. "I'd appreciate that," she said softly. The next day brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Abigail was hanging laundry behind the cookhouse when a smart buggy pulled up to the main house, a well-dressed man at the reins. From her vantage point, she watched as he tied his horse, straightened his coat, and approached the front door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Mrs. Holloway emerged from the cookhouse, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's Edgar Wilson from the bank in town," she explained, following Abigail's gaze. "Wonder what brings him all the way out here." They didn't wonder long. Within minutes, a ranch hand was dispatched to fetch Abigail to the main house, where Mr. Wilson waited in what Mrs. Holloway reverently called the parlor, a formal sitting room reserved for important guests. The banker rose when Abigail entered, a practiced smile beneath his waxed mustache. "Miss Zimmerman, my sincere condolences on your recent loss. I knew your father a fine man, very fine indeed." "Thank you," Abigail replied warily, taking the seat he indicated. "I've come on a matter of some importance," Wilson continued, retrieving a leather portfolio from beside his chair, "concerning your father's affairs." What followed was a detailed explanation of Thomas Zimmerman's financial situation, the mortgage on the homestead, nearly paid in full, a modest savings account at the Wyatt Bank, and most surprisingly, shares in a mining venture near Laramie. "The mining investment has performed rather well," Wilson explained, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the documents. "Not a fortune by any means, but certainly enough to clear any remaining debt on the property and leave you with a comfortable sum besides." Abigail stared at him, struggling to process this information. "Are you saying I'm not destitute?" Wilson coughed delicately. "Indeed not, Miss Zimmerman. Your father was prudent with his investments. While not wealthy by Eastern standards, you have sufficient means to either rebuild your homestead or perhaps establish yourself elsewhere, should you prefer." The news was like cool water to parched earth. Not wealth, certainly, but independence, the freedom to choose her own path rather than accept charity indefinitely. "I'll need time to consider my options," she said carefully. Of course. Wilson gathered his papers. "The funds are secure in our bank. Available whenever you make your decision." That evening, when Wyatt made his customary visit to the cabin, Abigail shared the banker's news. "That's good," he said simply, though something in his expression shifted. "Gives you choices." Yes. Abigail studied him, trying to read the sudden reserve in his manner. I'm thinking of rebuilding the house. His eyes met hers, searching. Are you sure that's what you want? No, she admitted. But it seems the right thing to do, to honor my parents. Wyatt was silent for a long moment. Your parents would want you to be happy, Abigail, not just honoring their memory. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent an unexpected warmth through her. I don't know what would make me happy anymore, she confessed. His expression softened. You will. In time. The next morning, Abigail woke with a new sense of purpose. After breakfast, she sought out Mrs. Holloway in the cookhouse. I need to learn, she announced without preamble. Mrs. Holloway looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. Learn what, dear? Everything. How to manage a household properly. How to preserve food for winter. How to, she hesitated, then pressed on, how to survive on my own. The older woman's eyes crinkled with understanding. Well now, that's a sensible plan. We'll start today. Over the following weeks, Abigail threw herself into a self-imposed apprenticeship. Under Mrs. Holloway's patient guidance, she learned to make soap, to distinguish healing herbs from poisonous ones, to smoke meat and preserve fruits, to manage household accounts. From the ranch hands, she learned other skills: how to mend harnesses, how to judge a horse's health, how to predict weather from the behavior of animals and the shape of clouds. She even convinced a reluctant cowboy named Charlie to teach her to shoot, spending hours practicing with a Winchester rifle until she could consistently hit targets at varying distances. Through it all, Wyatt watched with quiet approval, offering advice when asked but never directing or interfering. Their evening conversations continued, growing deeper as mutual respect blossomed into genuine friendship. One evening in early autumn, as they walked along Silver Creek in the golden light of sunset, Abigail broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. I've made a decision, she said, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water's surface. I'm going to rebuild the house. Wyatt nodded, his expression carefully neutral. I figured you might. But I need help, she continued. I can't do it alone. You won't have to. His voice was firm, reassuring. I know men who can frame a house in 3 days if the weather holds, and the hands here will help too, I'd wager. Abigail stopped walking, turning to face him directly. Why have you been so kind to me, Wyatt? From that first day when you had no reason to care what happened to a stranger. He looked away, his profile strong against the setting sun. Maybe I recognized something in you. A kind of strength that doesn't know itself yet. Or maybe you just felt sorry for me, she challenged gently. His eyes, when they met hers, held something that made her breath catch. I've never pitied you, Abigail, not once. The intensity of his gaze sent heat rising to her cheeks, and she looked away first. Well then, I should speak to Mr. Thornton about hiring builders. He returned yesterday, Wyatt said. I'll arrange a meeting. Albert Thornton proved to be nothing like the imposing figure Abigail had imagined. A slight man with thinning hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, he received her in his study with genuine warmth. Miss Zimmerman, I'm pleased to finally meet you, he said, rising from behind a massive oak desk. I've heard good things from Mrs. Holloway and from Wyatt, of course. Mr. Thornton, I wanted to thank you personally for your kindness, Abigail began. He waved away her thanks. Christian duty, nothing more. Now Wyatt tells me you're planning to rebuild your father's house. Yes, sir, I have some funds, thanks to my father's investments, but I'll need to hire builders. Thornton nodded thoughtfully. Sensible approach. Jenkins over in town is honest, won't overcharge you, and if Wyatt's willing to oversee things, you'll get a fair shake. Oversee? Abigail glanced at Wyatt, who stood near the door. Just to make sure the work's done right, Thornton explained. Builders sometimes take shortcuts when they think a woman won't notice. The meeting concluded with Thornton offering the use of his wagon and team whenever Abigail needed transportation to town or to her property. As they left the main house, Wyatt fell into step beside her. "You don't need to oversee the builders for me," she told him. "I'm sure you have enough duties here." "Actually, Mr. Thornton has agreed to lighten my responsibilities through winter," Wyatt replied. "Said I've earned some time to pursue personal interests." Something in his tone made Abigail look at him sharply. And what personal interests would those be? For the first time since she'd known him, Wyatt Thompson appeared almost uncomfortable. "Thought I might do some building myself. Been wanting to put up a place of my own for some time now." "You're leaving Silver Creek." The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss. "Not leaving, exactly. Thornton's offered me a parcel of land about 2 miles east of here. Said I've earned it after 10 years of service." "That's wonderful," Abigail said, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. "You deserve a place of your own." Wyatt studied her for a long moment. "Thought we might help each other, actually. I could assist with your rebuild, and maybe you could lend an eye to my plans, if you're willing." Relief flooded through her, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "I'd like that very much." Construction on the Zimmerman homestead began in late September, with a crew of 5 men plus Wyatt working to frame the house before winter set in. Abigail rode out each day to oversee progress and make decisions on layouts and materials. The new house would be similar to the original in size and structure, but with improvements. Wyatt suggested a proper root cellar, a stone chimney with a wider hearth, windows positioned to catch maximum light. On days when weather prevented travel, Abigail worked with Mrs. Holloway to prepare furnishings and household goods for the new home. The ranch hands, having accepted her as one of their own, contributed in unexpected ways. Hank the blacksmith fashioned hinges and latches for doors and cupboards. Charlie carved wooden pegs for hanging clothes. Even taciturn old Joe offered a handmade quilt that had belonged to his long-deceased wife. "Never had children to pass it to," he mumbled when presenting it to a stunned Abigail. "Seems a shame to let it sit in a trunk." As October gave way to November, and the first snow dusted the high country, the exterior of the house was completed, a sturdy 2-room structure with a covered porch and a pitched roof, designed to shed heavy snowfall. Work moved indoors, with plastering and flooring occupying the builder's attention. "We'll have you in by Christmas," Wyatt promised as they rode back to Silver Creek one crisp afternoon. "Though it won't be fully finished." "It doesn't need to be perfect," Abigail replied. "Just habitable." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "You sure you want to be out there alone for winter? First one's always the hardest." The question had haunted her as well. The thought of solitary evenings in the newly built house, surrounded by memories of what had been lost, held little appeal. "I need to start sometime," she said finally, "and I won't be completely alone. The Sullivan family's homestead is just 3 miles east." Wyatt nodded, though something like disappointment flickered across his features. "Of course, and I'll be just a few miles further once my own place is up." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. Abigail found herself studying Wyatt's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight hook in his nose, broken in a fall from a horse, he told her. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. When had his presence become so essential to her peace of mind? When had his opinions begun to matter more than anyone else's? When had the thought of not seeing him daily become so troubling? "Wyatt," she began, uncertain what she meant to say. A sudden gust of wind snatched her hat from her head, sending it tumbling across the prairie. Without hesitation, Wyatt wheeled his horse around, giving chase to the errant headgear. Abigail laughed despite herself, watching him bend low from the saddle to scoop it up in one fluid motion. "Your hat, madam," he said with mock formality when he returned, presenting it with a flourish. "My hero," she replied, matching his playful tone while accepting the slightly dented bonnet. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, recognition of a shared feeling neither had voiced. For a breathless moment, Abigail thought he might say something, might acknowledge the growing connection between them. Instead, he straightened in his saddle, gaze shifting to the horizon. "Storm's coming," he observed, nodding toward dark clouds gathering in the west. "We should hurry back." The weather turned harsh in the days that followed, with heavy snow blanketing the landscape and temperatures plummeting to bitter lows. Work on the homestead halted temporarily, though Wyatt assured Abigail it would resume as soon as conditions improved. Confined to the cabin and the immediate vicinity of the ranch buildings, Abigail found herself growing restless. She'd become accustomed to daily activity, to purpose, to progress. Now, with Christmas approaching and her plans delayed, a familiar melancholy threatened to overtake her. "You're brooding," Mrs. Holloway observed one afternoon as they worked together in the cookhouse, preparing pies for the upcoming holiday feast. "Just thinking," Abigail countered, crimping dough with perhaps more force than necessary. The older woman's knowing look said she wasn't fooled. "Thinking about a certain foreman, I'd wager." Heat rose to Abigail's cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Child, I've been watching young love bloom for 40 years, Mrs. Holloway said gently. "I know the signs." "It's not we're not," Abigail stammered, then sighed. "It's complicated." "Love always is." Mrs. Holloway patted her flour-covered hands on her apron. "But it's also the simplest thing in the world when you stop fighting it." Before Abigail could respond, the cookhouse door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and a snow-covered Wyatt. "There you are," he said, removing his hat and stomping snow from his boots. "Been looking all over." "What's wrong?" Abigail asked, alarm rising at his urgency. "Nothing's wrong," he assured her quickly. "Just wanted to show you something, if you're not too busy, Mrs." Holloway shooed her away with a knowing smile. "These pies can wait. Go on." Outside, the world had been transformed into a glittering white expanse. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape beneath a brilliant blue sky. Wyatt led Abigail to the stables where a sleigh awaited, hitched to a pair of sturdy draft horses. "Thought you might enjoy a ride," he explained, helping her into the conveyance. "Cabin fever's the worst part of winter." They set off across the snow-covered meadow, the sleigh's runners creating the only sound in the hushed winter tableau. Abigail found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement after days of confinement. "Where are we going?" she asked as Wyatt guided the horses toward a stand of evergreens. "Thought we might find a Christmas tree," he replied. "For the main house. Thornton likes to have one in the parlor each year." But when they reached the trees, Wyatt bypassed several perfect specimens, continuing deeper into the small forest until they reached a clearing sheltered by towering pines. Here, he halted the sleigh and helped Abigail down. "This isn't about Christmas trees, is it?" she asked, suddenly aware of how alone they were. Wyatt's expression was serious as he took both her hands in his. "No, it's not." "Then why?" "Because I needed to speak to you privately," he interrupted, his voice low and intense. "Because what I have to say isn't for anyone else to hear." Abigail's heart began to race. "I'm listening." "I know you've been through hell," he began, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know you're still finding your way, and I know this might be the worst timing in the world, but I can't keep silent anymore." He drew a deep breath as if gathering courage. Abigail Zimmerman, I'm in love with you. Have been since that day by the creek, when you told me about your parents with such pride in your voice, even through your grief. Maybe even before that. Abigail stared at him, unable to speak through the surge of emotion his words provoked. I don't expect anything, he continued hurriedly. Don't need an answer today or tomorrow or next month. Just needed you to know before you make your plans final, because if there's any chance any at all that you might someday feel something similar. He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Wyatt Thompson, Abigail finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. You are the most infuriating man I've ever met. His expression fell. I understand. I shouldn't have let me finish, she interrupted, tightening her grip on his hands. Infuriating because I've been waiting for weeks for you to say exactly those words. Because I've been falling in love with you since the moment you draped that blanket around my shoulders and told me to stay. The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over mountains. Without another word, he drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that melted the winter chill from her bones and kindled a warmth that spread to every part of her being. When they finally parted, breathless and laughing, snowflakes had begun to fall again, dusting their hair and shoulders with delicate crystals. Now what? Abigail asked, suddenly aware that her carefully laid plans had shifted beneath her feet. Wyatt brushed a snowflake from her cheek. Now we figure it out together, if that's what you want. It is, she said with certainty. But I still want my house rebuilt, he nodded, understanding in his eyes. And I still want mine built too. 2 houses, she teased. Seems excessive. His expression grew serious again. Unless they became 1 house. Eventually. The implication was clear, and Abigail felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. Are you proposing, Mr. Thompson? Not yet, he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When I do, you'll know it. I'm just laying groundwork. Very practical of you. I'm a practical man. He helped her back into the sleigh, tucking a blanket around her legs before joining her on the seat, with impractical feelings for an extraordinary woman. They returned to the ranch as twilight descended, their newfound understanding a warm secret between them. By silent agreement, they decided to keep their changed relationship private for the time being, though Abigail suspected Mrs. Holloway wasn't fooled for a moment by their casual demeanor. Christmas at Silver Creek was a revelation to Abigail, who had only ever celebrated the holiday in the quiet intimacy of her family home. The main house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Candles glowed in every window, and the scent of Mrs. Holloway's cooking perfumed the air from dawn to dusk. On Christmas Eve, the entire ranch gathered in the parlor, hands, house staff, and even neighboring ranchers who'd braved the snow for the occasion. Mr. Thornton read the Christmas story from his family Bible. Carols were sung with varying degrees of tunelessness, and gifts were exchanged, practical items mostly, though Abigail was touched to receive a leather-bound journal from Mrs. Holloway and a delicately carved wooden box from Wyatt. Open it later, he whispered when he presented it to her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. That night, alone in her cabin, Abigail opened the box to find a silver locket nestled on a bed of cotton. Inside was a tiny scrap of fabric, a piece of the blanket he'd given her that first night when her world had ended and, though she hadn't known it then, begun again. A note accompanied the gift. So you'll always remember where we started. Merry Christmas. Yours, W. Tears not of grief, but of overwhelming gratitude filled her eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. She fell asleep with her fingers curled around it, dreaming not of flames but of future possibilities. The new year brought renewed activity. With the weather moderating slightly, work resumed on the Zimmerman homestead. Simultaneously, Construction began on Wyatt's house, a sturdy one-room cabin with space for expansion, situated on a gentle rise overlooking a small tributary of Silver Creek. Abigail divided her time between the two building sites, offering suggestions here, making decisions there, all while trying to maintain the pretense that her interest in both properties was entirely separate. If the builders suspected the truth of the situation, they were discreet enough to keep their observations to themselves. By February, both structures were habitable if not fully complete. The decision of which to occupy first became a matter of lively debate between Abigail and Wyatt during their increasingly frequent private moments. "Your place has the better view," Abigail argued one evening as they sat before the fire in her cabin, planning the following day's work. "But yours has the bigger kitchen," Wyatt countered, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "And that fancy stove you insisted on." She leaned into him, enjoying the solid warmth of his presence. "We could always just stay here. It's comfortable enough." His expression grew serious. "Abigail, when we make a home together and I want it to be our choice, not a matter of convenience." She nodded, understanding his need for purposeful action rather than drift. It was one of the qualities she most admired in him, his intentionality, his refusal to let circumstances dictate his path. "Then I'll move to my house first," she decided. "It's what I planned from the beginning, what I need to do to honor my parents properly." Wyatt studied her face. "You're sure? You don't have to prove anything to anyone, least of all me." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Besides, it's not so far from your place, just a pleasant ride." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "A very pleasant ride indeed." In March, as the first hints of spring softened the Wyoming landscape, Abigail moved into the rebuilt Zimmerman homestead. The house, though similar in layout to her childhood home, felt different, newer, brighter, unburdened by tragic memories. She filled it with a mixture of new acquisitions and salvaged items from the ruins, creating a space that honored the past while embracing the future. Wyatt visited daily, ostensibly to complete finishing touches on the structure but increasingly to simply be with her. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, sharing meals and conversation, planning gardens and discussing livestock purchases, their future together unfolding naturally before them. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, Wyatt reached for Abigail's hand. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, squeezing his fingers. He smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "About names." "Names?" "Yes." He shifted to face her directly. "Specifically, whether you might consider changing yours to Thompson." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "Wyatt Thompson, is this your idea of a proposal?" "Not exactly." He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet pouch. "This is." From the pouch, he extracted a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of hers I managed to keep through all my travels." He slid from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Abigail Zimmerman, you came into my life on the worst day of yours, and somehow transformed my world in ways I never imagined possible. I love your strength, your determination, your compassion. I love the way you face challenges head-on, the way you've rebuilt not just a house but a life." He paused, drawing a steadying breath. "I want to share that life, all its joys and sorrows, its triumphs and setbacks. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Abigail's vision as she gazed down at this man who had become the center of her world. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Wyatt. I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, Abigail rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When?" she asked simply. "June," he suggested. "When the wildflowers are at their peak, we could be married right here on this land that means so much to you, to us." The wedding was indeed held in June, on a perfect Wyoming day with the Bighorn Mountains providing a majestic backdrop to the ceremony. Mr. Thornton arranged for a proper minister to ride out from Cheyenne, and Mrs. Holloway outdid herself preparing a feast for the considerable gathering of well-wishers. Abigail wore a dress of ivory silk ordered specially from Denver, her mother's restored locket at her throat and wildflowers in her hair. Wyatt, almost unrecognizable in a new suit and freshly trimmed hair, waited for her beneath an arch of twisted willow branches erected where the old Zimmerman house had once stood, a symbolic bridging of past and future that moved many guests to tears. The ceremony was simple but profound, their vows spoken clearly against the backdrop of wind through prairie grass. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the assembled crowd, startling a flock of meadowlarks into flight. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music provided by several ranch hands who proved surprisingly talented with fiddle and harmonica. As darkness fell, lanterns illuminated the impromptu dance floor where Abigail and Wyatt swayed together, lost in their private joy. "Happy," Wyatt murmured against her hair. "Beyond words," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. Later, after the guests had departed and quiet descended on the homestead, they stood together on the porch of what was now their home, arms wrapped around each other as they gazed at stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Abigail confessed softly. "After the fire, it seemed impossible." Wyatt's arms tightened around her. "Life has a way of surprising us, sometimes with tragedy, sometimes with joy beyond imagining." She turned in his embrace to face him. "Thank you for the blanket," she said, touching the locket at her throat, "and for telling me to stay." "Best words I ever spoke," he replied with a smile, "though I do might be a close second." Their laughter mingled in the night air as they turned to enter their home, stepping together into the future they had built from the ashes of the past. The years that followed brought changes to the Thompson homestead, as Abigail and Wyatt combined their lands and gradually expanded both their house and their operations. What began as a simple ranch grew into a respectable enterprise. With cattle grazing the excellent pastures Thomas Zimmerman had wisely claimed, and horses bred from stock Wyatt selected with his expert eye. In the spring of 1878, their first child arrived, a son they named Thomas Wyatt Thompson, in honor of both Abigail's father and the man who had given her reason to hope again. The boy grew sturdy and strong, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, twins Andrew and Elizabeth joined the family, bringing chaos and joy in equal measure to the expanding household. Wyatt proved to be a natural father, patient and loving yet firm when necessary. Abigail watched him teach their children to ride, to respect the land, to understand the rhythms of ranch life, and her heart swelled with gratitude for the family they had created together. The original cabin on Wyatt's land became a guest house, frequently occupied by Mrs. Holloway after her retirement from Silver Creek. The older woman doted on the Thompson children, regaling them with stories of the early days in Wyoming territory and teaching them the domestic skills she had once imparted to their mother. In 1885, when Wyoming was still a territory years away from statehood, Abigail became involved in the growing movement for women's suffrage. Her experiences had taught her the value of independence and self-determination, and she spoke passionately at local meetings about a woman's right to have a voice in governance. Wyatt supported her activism without reservation. "You rebuilt your life through your own strength and decisions," he told her. "Every woman deserves that same opportunity." Their partnership remained the foundation of all they achieved, a true meeting of equals, each bringing different strengths to their shared endeavors. They weathered the inevitable challenges of ranch life together: harsh winters, cattle diseases, economic downturns. Through it all, their commitment to each other never wavered. On the 10th anniversary of the fire that had changed Abigail's life forever, she and Wyatt rode together to the site of her parents' graves in the Wyatt Cemetery. They had become annual visitors, bringing flowers and teaching their children about the grandparents they would never know. "Do you ever wonder about how different life might have been?" Wyatt asked as they sat beside the well-tended graves. If the fire hadn't happened, Abigail considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I look at our children, at what we've built together, and I can't wish for any other path, even though I'd give anything to have had my parents know you, know our family." Wyatt nodded, understanding as always. "They'd be proud of you, of the woman you've become." "The woman you helped me become," she corrected gently. He shook his head. "No, Abigail, the strength was always in you. I just offered a blanket and a place to stay until you found it for yourself." As they rode home in the golden light of late afternoon, their children racing ahead on ponies, Abigail reflected on the journey from that smoke-filled day of despair to this moment of profound contentment. The path had not been straight or easy, but it had led to a richness of life she could never have imagined in those dark hours after the fire. That evening, with the children asleep and the ranch quiet under a canopy of stars, Abigail and Wyatt sat on their porch as they had countless nights before. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, they watched fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "I love you, Wyatt Thompson," she said softly. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." He kissed her gently, the gesture as familiar and essential as breathing. "And I love you, Abigail Thompson. Always have, always will." In that perfect moment, with the Wyoming wind whispering through prairie grass and the future stretching bright before them, Abigail silently thanked the twist of fate that had brought this man to her on her darkest day, the man who had given her not just a blanket against the cold, but a reason to stay, to hope, to love again.